The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly along the stone pathways. Unlike other children his age who might run and shout with excitement, George moved with a thoughtful grace that seemed beyond his years. His small hands were clasped behind his back, and his eyes took in everything around him with careful attention. Today was different from his usual routine. Instead of heading straight to his morning lessons, George had asked his tutor for permission to explore the castle grounds alone. Something had been weighing on his mind for weeks, and he needed time to think. The young prince had noticed things that others seemed to overlook, small details that touched his heart in ways he couldn't quite explain. As he walked past the servants' quarters, George paused. Through a window he could see Mrs. Patterson, one of the kitchen staff, sitting at a small table with her head in her hands. She was an elderly woman who had worked at the castle for nearly 30 years, always greeting everyone with a warm smile and kind words. But today, her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. George had learned from his parents about the importance of respecting people's privacy, but something inside him stirred with concern. He had seen Mrs. Patterson looking sad for several days now, though she tried to hide it behind her usual cheerful demeanor. The young prince knew that sometimes people needed help, even when they were too proud to ask for it. Moving closer to the window, George noticed a stack of papers on the table beside Mrs. Patterson. Even from his position outside, he could see they looked official and important. The woman's weathered hands trembled as she picked up one of the documents, her eyes scanning the words with obvious distress. George's mind raced as he remembered conversations he had overheard between his parents about the challenges many people faced with money and housing. Though he was young, he understood that not everyone lived in castles or had access to the same privileges he did. His parents had always taught him about compassion and the responsibility that came with his position. The young prince stepped back from the window, not wanting to invade Mrs. Patterson's privacy further, but the image of her distress remained burned in his mind. He continued his walk, but now his thoughts were entirely focused on how he might help. George had always been a quiet child, preferring to observe and listen rather than speak loudly or demand attention. This quality had allowed him to notice things that others missed. As he made his way toward the main castle entrance, George encountered James, one of the younger security guards who had recently joined the Royal Protection Team. James was standing at his post, but George could see the man's uniform looked worn and his shoes were scuffed beyond what would normally be acceptable for someone in his position. George had spoken with James several times during his walks around the castle. The guard was always respectful and kind, often sharing stories about his family when the young prince showed interest. George knew that James had a young daughter at home, and that he worked extra hours to support his family. The prince paused near James, pretending to examine a flower bed while actually observing the guard more carefully. He noticed that James's uniform jacket had been mended in several places, the stitching done carefully but clearly visible upon close inspection. The young man's face showed the strain of long hours and worry. Though he maintained his professional composure, something stirred in George's chest, a feeling he was beginning to recognize as the desire to help others. He had been taught that true leadership meant serving others, especially those who couldn't help themselves. But he also understood that help needed to be given in a way that preserved people's dignity. George's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on gravel. Looking up, he saw Captain Morrison, the head of security, approaching with his usual stern expression. Captain Morrison was a man in his 50s who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. He was known for his unwavering dedication and strict adherence to protocol. The captain nodded respectfully to George as he passed, but the young prince noticed something unusual. Captain Morrison's typically perfect posture seemed slightly strained, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested he was dealing with some kind of pain or discomfort. George had always been taught to observe people carefully, to understand their needs and feelings even when they didn't express them openly. His grandmother, the Queen, had often told him that a good leader must have eyes that see beyond the surface and a heart that feels for others. As the morning progressed, George continued his observations while participating in his regular activities. During his riding lesson, he noticed that Tom, the stable master, moved more slowly than usual, and occasionally winced when he thought no one was looking. At lunch, he saw Maria, one of the housekeeping staff, quietly wiping tears from her eyes as she arranged flowers in the dining room. Each person he encountered seemed to be carrying some burden, some worry that they felt they had to bear alone. George began to understand that even in a place as grand as Windsor Castle, surrounded by luxury and privilege, there were people struggling with very real problems. That evening, as George sat in his room completing his homework, his mind kept returning to the faces he had seen throughout the day. Mrs. Patterson's tears, James's worn uniform, Captain Morrison's hidden pain, Tom's careful movements, Maria's quiet sadness. All of it weighed heavily on his young heart. George knew that his position as a prince meant he had resources and influence that others didn't possess. But he also knew that using that power required wisdom and discretion. He couldn't simply throw money at problems or make grand gestures that might embarrass the very people he wanted to help. As he prepared for bed that night, George made a decision. He would find a way to help these people, but he would do it quietly without fanfare or recognition. True kindness, he realized, was not about being seen or praised for good deeds. It was about making a difference in people's lives simply because it was the right thing to do. The next morning brought a gentle rain to Windsor Castle, creating a peaceful atmosphere that matched George's contemplative mood. He had spent much of the night thinking about the people he had observed the previous day, and by dawn he had formed the beginning of a plan. George's first stop was his father's study, where he knew he would find not just conversation, but also access to information that might help him understand the situations he had witnessed. Prince William was reviewing some documents when George knocked softly on the door. "Come in," his father called, looking up with a warm smile as George entered. "You're up early this morning, George. How are you feeling?" George approached his father's desk thoughtfully. He had always felt comfortable talking with his parents, but this conversation felt particularly important. "Father, I wanted to ask you something about the people who work here at the castle." Prince William set down his papers, giving his son his full attention. He had learned to recognize when George had something serious on his mind, and he respected his son's thoughtful nature. "What would you like to know?" William asked, leaning back in his chair. George chose his words carefully. "I've noticed that some of the staff members seem worried or sad lately. I was wondering if there's anything we could do to help them, but without making them feel embarrassed or uncomfortable." William studied his son's face, impressed by the maturity and compassion in his question. "That's a very thoughtful observation, George. Can you tell me more about what you've noticed?" Over the next few minutes, George shared his observations about Mrs. Patterson, James, Captain Morrison, and the others. He was careful not to reveal anything too personal that he had seen, but he expressed his genuine concern for their well-being. William listened intently, proud of his son's empathy, but also recognizing an opportunity to teach an important lesson about leadership and service. "You know, George, one of the most important qualities of good leadership is exactly what you're demonstrating right now, the ability to see and care about the people around you. But how can I help them without making them feel bad?" George asked. "I don't want anyone to think I'm feeling sorry for them or that I think they can't take care of themselves." William smiled at his son's wisdom. "That's exactly the right question to ask. Sometimes the best way to help people is to create opportunities for them to succeed, rather than simply giving them things directly." Father and son spent the next hour discussing different approaches to helping others with dignity and respect. William shared stories from his own experiences with charitable work and community service, emphasizing the importance of understanding people's actual needs, rather than just assuming what they might want. By the time George left his father's study, he had a much clearer understanding of how he might proceed. His plan was beginning to take shape, but he knew he would need to be patient and careful in how he implemented it. George's next stop was the castle library, where he spent time researching different charitable organizations and community support programs. He was particularly interested in learning about programs that helped people with housing issues, healthcare needs, and educational opportunities for their children. As he read through various materials, George began to understand the complexity of the problems that people faced. It wasn't just about money, though that was often a significant factor. People also needed access to resources, information, and sometimes just someone who believed in their potential. Later that morning, George encountered Mrs. Patterson in one of the castle corridors. She was carrying a tray of tea service, moving with her usual efficiency despite the sadness that George had observed the day before. "Good morning," Mrs. Patterson, George said politely, falling into step beside her. Good morning. Your Royal Highness, she replied with a gentle smile. How are your studies going today? George walked alongside her for a moment, trying to think of a natural way to learn more about her situation. Mrs. Patterson, I was wondering, you've worked here at the castle for a very long time, haven't you? Yes, nearly 30 years now, she said with a note of pride in her voice. I started working in the kitchens when I was just a bit older than you are now. That's wonderful, George said genuinely. You must have seen a lot of changes over the years. Do you have family nearby? Mrs. Patterson's expression clouded slightly, though she tried to maintain her cheerful demeanor. I have a grandson, actually. He's about your age. Very bright boy. Loves to read and learn about everything. George noticed the way her voice changed when she mentioned her grandson, becoming both prouder and sadder at the same time. That sounds lovely. Does he go to school nearby? He does, Mrs. Patterson said, but then paused as if she had revealed more than she intended. Well, he has been. We're hoping he can continue. The conversation was interrupted when they reached Mrs. Patterson's destination, and she excused herself to deliver the tea service. But George had learned something important. Mrs. Patterson's sadness seemed to be connected to concerns about her grandson's education, which aligned with some of the official-looking papers he had glimpsed on her table. Throughout the rest of the day, George continued his careful observations and gentle conversations with various staff members. He spoke with James about his family during a brief encounter near the main entrance, learning that the young guard's daughter was starting school soon, and that he was working extra shifts to save money for her uniform and supplies. During his afternoon walk, George made a point of stopping by the stables to check on his horse. While there, he chatted with Tom, the stablemaster, who mentioned in passing that he had been putting off a visit to the doctor because he was too busy with work and couldn't afford to take time off. Each conversation was brief and natural, but George was building a clearer picture of the challenges facing the people around him. He was also beginning to see patterns in the types of problems they faced: educational expenses, healthcare costs, housing concerns, and the general struggle to balance work responsibilities with family needs. That evening, George sat in his room making notes about everything he had learned. He wasn't writing down anything too personal or private, but he wanted to remember the important details so he could think about how to help each person in a way that would truly make a difference. As he worked, George realized that his observations had taught him something important about leadership. Real leaders didn't just make big speeches or appear at formal events. They paid attention to the people around them, understood their needs, and worked quietly behind the scenes to create positive change. George fell asleep that night with his mind full of possibilities. Excited about the plans that were beginning to form, he knew that helping others would require patience, creativity, and careful thought, but he was determined to make a difference in whatever way he could. The following week, George put his plan into action with the careful precision of someone much older than his years. He had spent considerable time thinking about how to help each person he had observed, and now he was ready to begin implementing his ideas. His first initiative involved Mrs. Patterson's grandson. George had learned through his research that there were several excellent scholarship programs available for children who showed academic promise, but whose families faced financial challenges. The key was finding a way to connect Mrs. Patterson with these opportunities without making her feel like she was receiving charity. George approached his tutor, Mr. Henderson, with a seemingly innocent request. Mr. Henderson, I've been thinking about how fortunate I am to have access to good education, and I was wondering if there are programs that help other children get similar opportunities. Mr. Henderson, a wise man who had taught several generations of royal children, recognized the genuine concern in George's voice. There are indeed many such programs, Your Royal Highness. What specifically interests you about this topic? George explained that he had been thinking about children his age who might not have the same educational advantages, and he wondered if there was a way to learn more about these programs or even help support them in some way. That's a very mature perspective. George, Mr. Henderson said approvingly, would you like me to research some of these programs? Perhaps we could even arrange for you to visit one of the schools that benefits from such initiatives. George's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. That would be wonderful. And Mr. Henderson, if we do visit a school, Would it be possible to meet with some of the staff here at the castle who might have children or grandchildren? They might have insights about education that could help me understand these programs better. Mr. Henderson agreed to arrange such a meeting, not realizing that he was becoming an unwitting accomplice in George's charitable scheme. Within a few days, he had organized an informal discussion about educational opportunities, inviting several castle staff members who had children or grandchildren of school age. Mrs. Patterson was among those invited to the discussion. When Mr. Henderson mentioned the various scholarship and support programs that were available, he made sure to provide detailed information about application processes and eligibility requirements. George watched quietly as Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened with interest and hope. During the meeting, Mr. Henderson announced that Prince George had expressed interest in supporting one of these educational programs, and that the royal family would be making information about various opportunities available to all castle staff. George had convinced his parents that this was an excellent way for him to learn about educational policy while also helping people in their community. Mrs. Patterson stayed after the meeting to ask more questions about the programs, and within a week, she had submitted an application for her grandson. George later learned that the boy had been accepted with full support for his education, including books, uniforms, and even tutoring assistance. George's next project involved James, the young security guard with the worn uniform. This challenge required more creativity, as George knew that directly offering to replace James's uniform might be seen as criticism of his appearance or financial situation. The solution came to George during a conversation with Captain Morrison about security protocols. George mentioned that he had been reading about the importance of professional appearance in security work, and wondered if the castle had programs to ensure that all security staff had access to proper equipment and uniforms. Captain Morrison explained that while the castle did provide uniforms, replacement schedules sometimes lagged behind actual needs, especially for newer staff members who might be harder on their equipment as they learned their duties. George suggested that perhaps the royal family could implement a more frequent replacement program, framing it as an investment in security effectiveness rather than charity. He even volunteered to help research the costs and logistics of such a program as part of his studies in management and administration. Within 2 weeks, a new policy was announced providing all security staff with additional uniform allowances and more frequent replacement schedules. James received his new uniforms as part of the general policy change, never knowing that his situation had inspired the entire initiative. For Tom, the stable master who had been avoiding medical care, George took a different approach. He had learned from his parents about the importance of preventive health care, and he was concerned that Tom's reluctance to see a doctor might lead to more serious problems. George began spending more time in the stables, genuinely enjoying his interactions with the horses, but also observing Tom's movements and occasional signs of discomfort. During one of these visits, George asked Tom about the care that horses received from veterinarians and how important regular checkups were for maintaining their health. The conversation naturally evolved into a discussion about human health care, with George expressing curiosity about how people in physically demanding jobs took care of their own health. Tom mentioned his own reluctance to take time off work for medical appointments, citing both the cost and the inconvenience. George saw his opportunity and suggested that perhaps the castle could arrange for periodic health screenings for all staff members, bringing healthcare professionals to the castle rather than requiring staff to take time off work. He positioned this as both a benefit for employees and a smart business practice that would help maintain productivity and reduce long-term healthcare costs. When George presented this idea to his parents, they were impressed by his thoughtfulness and agreed to implement a comprehensive employee wellness program. The program included regular health screenings, preventive care, and even coverage for treatments that might not be fully covered by standard healthcare plans. Tom was among the first to take advantage of the new program, and the early screening revealed a treatable condition that could have become serious if left unaddressed. He was able to receive proper treatment without any cost or time away from work. As these various initiatives began to take effect, George noticed changes in the atmosphere around the castle. Mrs. Patterson's smile seemed more genuine, and she often spoke proudly about her grandson's progress in his new school. James carried himself with increased confidence in his crisp new uniform, and his improved appearance had even led to commendation from his supervisors. Tom moved with less obvious discomfort and had begun sharing stories about his improved health with other staff members. Most importantly, word of the various new programs had spread throughout the castle community, creating a sense of appreciation and loyalty that went far beyond the specific benefits themselves. George realized that his actions were having a ripple effect he hadn't anticipated. People were not only benefiting directly from the programs he had inspired, but they were also feeling more valued and respected as members of the castle community. The young prince began to understand that true leadership wasn't just about helping individuals, but about creating systems and environments where people could thrive. His quiet observations and careful actions were changing the culture of the castle in ways that would benefit everyone for years to come. Several weeks after implementing his initial programs, George began to notice something unexpected happening around the castle. The positive changes he had quietly orchestrated were creating waves of kindness that extended far beyond his original intentions. Maria, the housekeeper who had been quietly crying while arranging flowers, approached George one morning as he walked through the corridor. She had heard about the various programs being implemented and wanted to express her gratitude, though she didn't realize that the young prince had been the driving force behind them. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to thank you and your family for all the wonderful changes happening here. The new programs have made such a difference for so many of us." George listened carefully as Maria explained that her own family had been struggling with housing costs, and the additional benefits and support programs had helped them avoid a potential crisis. She spoke about how the sense of security and care had improved not just her own situation, but the morale of the entire staff. "You know," Maria continued, "it's not just the practical help, though, that's been wonderful. It's the feeling that we matter, that someone cares about our well-being. It makes us all want to do our best work and take even better care of this beautiful castle." After Maria left, George reflected on her words. He was beginning to understand that kindness had a multiplying effect. When people felt valued and cared for, they naturally wanted to extend that same care to others around them. This lesson became even clearer over the following days as George observed changes in how the staff interacted with each other. Mrs. Patterson had begun mentoring some of the younger kitchen staff, sharing both her professional expertise and her experience navigating the various support programs. James had volunteered to help train new security personnel, taking pride in his role and appearance in ways that inspired others to maintain high standards. Tom had become an advocate for the health and wellness programs, encouraging his colleagues to take advantage of the screenings and preventive care options. His own improved health had made him more energetic and positive, which created a better atmosphere throughout the stables and grounds. But perhaps the most significant change George noticed was in Captain Morrison. The head of security had always been professional and competent, but there had been a certain sternness about him that kept people at a distance. Now George observed a warmth in his interactions with the staff that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, George decided to have a conversation with Captain Morrison to better understand this change. He found the captain reviewing security protocols in his office and asked if he could speak with him about the recent improvements around the castle. Captain Morrison welcomed the conversation, and as they talked, George learned something that surprised him. The captain revealed that he had been dealing with chronic pain from an old injury, and his stern demeanor had partly been a way of managing his discomfort without showing weakness in front of his team. "The new health programs have been a blessing. Your Royal Highness," Captain Morrison said, "I was finally able to get proper treatment for an injury I sustained years ago in military service. The improvement in my physical comfort has made me a better leader and, I hope, a more approachable person." George listened intently as the captain explained how the changes in castle policy had affected him personally and professionally. "But there's something more," Morrison continued. "The thoughtfulness behind these programs, the attention to staff well-being, it's inspired all of us to pay more attention to each other." The captain went on to describe how security staff had begun looking out for each other more actively, how they had started informal mentoring programs, and how the improved morale had actually enhanced security effectiveness throughout the castle. George was amazed to learn that his quiet initiatives had created improvements he hadn't even considered. Better staff morale meant better performance, stronger teamwork, and a more positive environment for everyone, including his own family. As days passed, George continued to observe the expanding circles of kindness around the castle. He noticed that visitors and guests often commented on the exceptional warmth and professionalism of the staff. The castle was developing a reputation not just for its historical significance and royal grandeur, but for the genuine care and attention demonstrated by everyone who worked there. One particularly meaningful moment came when George overheard a conversation between two tourists who were taking a public tour of the castle. They were discussing how impressed they were with the staff's knowledge, enthusiasm, and genuine friendliness. "You can tell these people really love their work," one tourist said to the other. "Everyone we've met has been so helpful and seems genuinely happy to be here. It makes the whole experience so much more special." George realized that his actions were affecting not just the staff and their families, but also the countless visitors who came to the castle each year. The kindness and care that had started with his observations was now touching the lives of people from all over the world. This realization led George to think about the broader implications of what he had accomplished. He began to understand that leadership wasn't just about making grand gestures or implementing major policies. Sometimes the most significant changes came from paying attention to small details and showing care for individual people. George also began to appreciate the wisdom of his approach. By working quietly behind the scenes and creating systemic changes rather than direct charity, he had preserved everyone's dignity while still addressing their needs. People felt empowered and valued rather than pitied or dependent. The young prince started keeping a private journal, where he recorded his observations about the ongoing effects of his initiatives. He wrote about the importance of seeing people as individuals with unique needs and circumstances, rather than just roles or positions. He also wrote about the responsibility that came with privilege and position. George was learning that having access to resources and influence meant having an obligation to use those advantages for the benefit of others, especially those who couldn't help themselves. Most importantly, George was discovering that true satisfaction came not from recognition or praise, but from knowing that his actions had made genuine differences in people's lives. The fact that most people didn't know he was responsible for the positive changes made his success even more meaningful. As he prepared for bed one evening, George looked out his window at the castle grounds, where he had first noticed the struggles of the people around him. Now those same grounds seemed filled with a different energy, one of hope, security, and mutual care. George smiled to himself, already thinking about what other improvements he might be able to inspire. He was beginning to understand that kindness wasn't just an action, but a way of seeing the world and responding to the needs of others with creativity, respect, and love. 3 months after George's initial observations, an unexpected event would test everything he had learned about leadership, kindness, and the true meaning of service. It began on a crisp autumn morning when urgent news arrived that would shake the entire castle community. Captain Morrison received a call in his office that changed everything. A family emergency required him to travel immediately to Scotland, where his elderly mother had suffered a serious fall and needed extensive care. The captain's distress was visible to everyone as he tried to balance his personal crisis with his professional responsibilities. George happened to be walking past Morrison's office when he overheard the phone conversation. Through the partially open door, he could see the usually composed captain struggling with emotions as he spoke to someone about his mother's condition and the difficult decisions he faced. After Morrison ended the call, George knocked softly on the door. The captain looked up, his professional mask slipping to reveal the worry and exhaustion underneath. "Captain Morrison," George said gently, "I couldn't help but notice that you seem upset. Is there anything I can do to help?" Morrison hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to maintain professional boundaries and his need for support during this difficult time. "Your Royal Highness, I apologize if I seemed distracted. I received some concerning news about my mother's health." George stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, sensing that the captain needed privacy for this conversation. "I'm very sorry to hear that. What can we do to help you handle this situation?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern and without any hint of judgment, seemed to break down Morrison's reserve. He explained that his mother lived alone in a small Scottish village, and her fall had resulted in broken bones and complications that would require months of recovery and care. "I need to be with her," Morrison said, his voice heavy with worry, "but I can't abandon my responsibilities here." The security of the castle and your family's safety are my primary obligations. George listened carefully, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of situation where his position and resources could make a real difference. But he also understood that Morrison's dilemma went deeper than just logistics. It was about honor, duty, and the conflict between personal and professional responsibilities. "Captain Morrison," George said thoughtfully, "you've served our family with dedication and excellence for many years. Your mother raised the man who has protected us so well. I think helping you care for her is not separate from your duty to us, it's part of it." Morrison looked at the young prince with surprise and growing emotion. "Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not sure what options I have." George had already begun thinking through possibilities. "What if we could arrange for you to coordinate your mother's care while still maintaining your responsibilities here? We have resources that could help make that possible." Over the next hour, George and Morrison discussed various options. The young prince suggested that they could arrange for professional caregivers to assist Morrison's mother, allowing him to travel back and forth as needed while ensuring she received proper care. George also proposed temporarily restructuring the security team to share responsibilities, reducing Morrison's daily workload during this difficult period. "But Your Royal Highness," Morrison protested, "the costs of professional care, the travel expenses, the adjustments to security protocols, I couldn't ask for such accommodations." George smiled with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. "Captain Morrison, you're not asking for anything. I'm offering these things because they're the right thing to do. You've dedicated your career to taking care of our family. Now it's our turn to help you take care of yours." The captain's eyes filled with tears as he realized that the young prince was serious about providing this level of support. It was more than he had dared to hope for, and it would solve not just his immediate crisis but also his long-term concerns about his mother's well-being. Within days, George had worked with his parents to arrange comprehensive support for Morrison's situation. Professional caregivers were hired to provide round-the-clock care for Morrison's mother, allowing her to remain in her own home while receiving excellent medical attention. A schedule was created that allowed Morrison to spend several days each week in Scotland while maintaining his oversight of castle security. The security team rallied around their leader during this difficult time, with senior staff members stepping up to handle additional responsibilities and newer team members, like James, taking on expanded roles that helped them develop their skills and confidence. But the most remarkable aspect of this situation was how it revealed the depth of the caring community that George's earlier initiatives had helped create. Staff members throughout the castle spontaneously organized support for Morrison and his family, Mrs. Patterson, and the kitchen staff prepared meals that Morrison could take to Scotland for himself and his mother. Tom and the grounds crew made sure Morrison's duties were covered, so he never had to worry about work responsibilities while he was away. Maria and the housekeeping staff even arranged for flowers to be sent to Morrison's mother as she recovered. George watched these developments with amazement and pride. The culture of caring and mutual support that had grown from his initial observations had now become self-sustaining. People were helping each other not because they were asked to, but because it had become natural and instinctive for them to do so. Morrison's gratitude was evident every time he interacted with the castle staff upon returning from Scotland. He often spoke about how the support he had received had not only solved his practical problems, but had also given him strength during one of the most difficult periods of his life. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said to George during one of their regular security briefings, "I don't know how to adequately express my appreciation for what you and your family have done for my mother and me, but I want you to know that it's changed how I understand what it means to serve others." George listened as Morrison explained that the experience had taught him about the difference between doing a job and being part of a community. "I always took pride in my professional excellence," Morrison said, "but now I understand that true service means caring about the whole person, not just their performance." The captain went on to describe how the kindness he had received had inspired him to look for ways to better support his own team members. He had begun implementing small but meaningful changes in how the security department operated, creating more opportunities for mentorship, professional development, and mutual support among the guards. George realized that Morrison's crisis and the community response to it had created a powerful example of what was possible when people genuinely cared for each other. The situation had tested the culture of kindness that had been developing in the castle, and that culture had proven to be strong and genuine. Moreover, George saw that his role in supporting Morrison had been different from his earlier initiatives. This time he had acted more directly and openly, showing that there were times when visible leadership was just as important as quiet behind-the-scenes work. As Morrison's mother recovered and the immediate crisis passed, George reflected on everything he had learned from the experience. He understood now that true leadership meant being ready to respond to unexpected challenges with creativity, compassion, and courage. As winter approached Windsor Castle, George's acts of kindness had created something extraordinary that even he hadn't anticipated. The community of care that had grown within the castle walls was about to face its greatest test and reveal the true depth of the transformation that had taken place. The challenge came in the form of an announcement that would affect everyone at the castle. Due to budget considerations and changing security requirements, there would need to be significant restructuring of staff positions. Some roles would be eliminated, others would be combined, and several long-term employees faced the possibility of losing their jobs. The news created anxiety throughout the castle community. People who had felt secure and valued suddenly faced uncertainty about their futures. George watched with concern as the atmosphere of hope and mutual support began to give way to worry and fear. Mrs. Patterson was among those whose position was at risk. The kitchen staff was being reduced, and despite her 30 years of service, her age made her vulnerable to being let go. George could see the familiar sadness returning to her face as she tried to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor while dealing with her fears about the future. James, who had grown in confidence and skill over the past months, was also facing potential job loss as the security team was being streamlined. The progress he had made in developing his career seemed threatened by circumstances beyond his control. Even Tom, whose health had improved significantly due to the wellness programs, was uncertain about his future as the grounds and stable operations were being reorganized. The stress of the situation was beginning to affect his physical well-being again, undermining the progress he had made. George realized that this crisis called for a different kind of leadership than he had exercised before. The quiet, behind-the-scenes approach that had worked so well for his earlier initiatives wouldn't be sufficient for a challenge of this magnitude. He needed to find a way to address the situation more directly, while still maintaining the dignity and respect of the people involved. After spending several days observing and thinking, George made a decision that would surprise everyone, including his parents. He requested a meeting with the senior staff responsible for implementing the restructuring, including the castle's administrator, the head of human resources, and the financial director. When George walked into the meeting room, the adults present were unsure what to expect. A 10-year-old prince requesting a formal meeting about personnel decisions was unprecedented, and they weren't certain how to respond to his presence. George began the meeting with a directness that commanded respect despite his age. "I've asked to meet with you today because I'm concerned about how the current restructuring plans will affect the people who work here at the castle." He went on to present a detailed analysis of the various staff members who faced job loss, describing not only their professional contributions, but also their personal circumstances and the impact that losing their positions would have on their families. "Mrs. Patterson has 30 years of institutional knowledge," George explained. "She knows every detail of royal food preferences, dietary requirements, and special event protocols. Training someone new to replace her expertise would be expensive and time-consuming." He continued with similar arguments for each person at risk, demonstrating a level of understanding about their work and value that impressed the administrators. George had clearly spent considerable time researching and thinking about each individual case. But the most surprising part of George's presentation came when he began proposing alternative solutions. Instead of simply asking for people to keep their current jobs, he had developed creative ideas for restructuring that would preserve employment while still achieving the necessary cost savings. "What if we created cross-training programs that allow people to work in multiple departments?" George suggested. Mrs. Patterson could train others in kitchen protocols, while also helping with event planning and guest services. James could combine security duties with visitor coordination and educational tours. George's proposals demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of efficiency and resource management that went far beyond what anyone expected from someone his age. He had clearly been paying attention to much more than just the personal circumstances of the staff. The administrators listened with growing amazement as George outlined a comprehensive plan that would actually improve castle operations while preserving jobs. His ideas included creating new revenue streams through expanded tours and educational programs, implementing efficiency measures that would reduce costs without reducing staff, and developing professional development programs that would increase the value and versatility of existing employees. Most remarkably, George had calculated the financial implications of his proposals and could demonstrate that they would achieve the required budget targets while actually improving service quality and staff satisfaction. Your Royal Highness, the administrator said after George finished his presentation, these are remarkably thoughtful and practical suggestions. How did you develop such detailed knowledge of our operations? George smiled modestly. I've been watching and learning from everyone here for months. I've seen how dedicated and skilled our staff members are, and I've also seen how much they care about the castle and our family. It seemed wasteful to lose that expertise and loyalty when we could find ways to use it more effectively instead. The meeting ended with the administrators agreeing to seriously consider George's proposals. They were not only impressed by his ideas but also moved by his obvious concern for the people who worked at the castle. Over the following weeks, George's proposals were refined and implemented. The restructuring went forward, but in a way that preserved jobs while creating new opportunities for professional growth and increased responsibility. Mrs. Patterson became the head of special events coordination, using her extensive knowledge of royal preferences and protocols to improve the quality of official functions. James was promoted to head of visitor services, combining his security training with his natural friendliness to create better experiences for castle guests. Tom was given expanded responsibilities that included overseeing grounds, maintenance for other royal properties, allowing him to travel and use his expertise more widely while maintaining his base at Windsor. The success of these changes created a new model for how the royal household could operate more efficiently while maintaining its commitment to the people who served it. George's intervention had not only saved jobs but had also improved operations in ways that would benefit everyone for years to come. More importantly, George's willingness to step forward and advocate directly for the staff had demonstrated a level of leadership and courage that inspired everyone around him. People began to understand that their young prince was not just kind-hearted, but was also developing into someone who would fight for what he believed was right. Captain Morrison, who had returned to full duties as his mother's condition stabilized, was particularly moved by George's actions during the crisis. Your Royal Highness, he said, what you did for our colleagues during the restructuring showed me something I'll never forget. That true leadership means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult or unexpected. George's response revealed his growing understanding of his role and responsibilities. Captain Morrison, I learned from watching all of you that the most important part of leadership is caring about the people you serve with. Everyone here has taught me that by how they care for each other and for our family. 6 months after George's first quiet observations, Windsor Castle had transformed into something remarkable that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The changes that began with a young prince's simple desire to help others had created a model of leadership and community that would influence how the royal household operated for generations to come. The transformation became fully apparent during a special ceremony that no one had planned, but that emerged naturally from the culture of appreciation and respect that had developed. Captain Morrison, working with other senior staff members, had quietly organized an event to recognize the improvements in castle operations and staff satisfaction over the past year. What made this ceremony extraordinary was not its formal aspects, but the genuine emotion and gratitude that filled the room as people spoke about how their work environment had changed. Mrs. Patterson, now thriving in her new role coordinating special events, spoke about how the past months had renewed her love for her work and her pride in serving the royal family. For 30 years, I thought my job was just to prepare food and follow protocols, she said, her voice filled with emotion. But this year I learned that my real job is to be part of a community that cares for each other and works together to create something beautiful. James, confident and professional in his expanded role, described how the changes had affected not just his career, but his entire outlook on life. "I came here thinking I just needed to do my duties and collect my paycheck," he explained. "Instead, I found a place where I could grow, learn, and contribute to something much bigger than myself." Tom spoke about how the health and wellness programs had given him not just better physical health, but also the energy and enthusiasm to mentor younger staff members and share his knowledge more broadly. "I've learned that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary if you want to take care of others properly." Each person who spoke described not just practical improvements in their working conditions, but fundamental changes in how they understood their roles and their relationships with the people around them. The ceremony revealed that George's initiatives had created something far more valuable than he had originally intended. But the most moving moment of the ceremony came when Captain Morrison asked George to step forward. The young prince had been watching from the back of the room, trying to stay inconspicuous as people shared their stories and experiences. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, his voice carrying the respect and admiration of everyone present. "We all know that the changes we've experienced didn't happen by accident. While we may not understand exactly how everything came together, we know that your family's commitment to our well-being has made all the difference." Morrison paused, looking directly at George with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and recognition. "More than that, we've all learned by watching you that leadership isn't about giving orders or making speeches. It's about seeing people clearly, understanding their needs, and finding ways to help them succeed." The captain then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He stepped back, came to attention, and gave George a formal salute. Not the casual acknowledgement usually given to a young prince, but the full respectful salute reserved for a commanding officer. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice steady and clear, "you have shown us what it means to lead with wisdom, compassion, and integrity. It has been an honor to serve under your guidance." One by one, every person in the room followed Morrison's example. Mrs. Patterson, tears streaming down her face, stepped forward and curtsied deeply. James and the other security personnel snapped to attention and saluted. Tom and the grounds crew removed their hats and bowed respectfully. Even the senior administrators and household managers, who had initially been skeptical of George's proposals during the restructuring crisis, stood and acknowledged the young prince's remarkable contributions to the castle community. George stood in stunned silence as he realized that his secret was no longer secret. Somehow the people around him had recognized his role in the positive changes that had transformed their workplace and their lives. More than that, they were honoring him not just as a prince, but as a leader who had earned their respect through his actions. Fighting back tears of his own, George looked around the room at the faces of people he had come to know and care about deeply. He saw Mrs. Patterson's grandson's scholarship certificate hanging proudly on the wall behind her. He noticed James's confident posture in his perfectly fitted uniform. He observed Tom's healthy complexion and energetic demeanor, but most importantly, George saw something in their faces that he had never seen before, a sense of pride, security, and belonging that came from knowing they were valued not just for their work, but as complete human beings with families, dreams, and challenges of their own. When George finally found his voice, his words came from the heart rather than from any formal training in public speaking. "Thank you all for teaching me what real leadership looks like," he said simply. "Everything I've learned about caring for others, I learned by watching how you care for each other and for my family." He paused, looking around the room at the people who had become so much more than employees to him. "You've shown me that the most important part of being a prince isn't the title or the position, it's the opportunity to serve others and to help create a community where everyone can thrive." George's final words would be remembered and repeated throughout the royal household for years to come. "I hope that someday, when I'm older and have more responsibilities, I'll be able to lead with the same kindness, dedication, and integrity that all of you show every single day." As the ceremony concluded and people gradually returned to their duties, George remained in the room for a few extra minutes, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about his first quiet observation 6 months earlier, when he had simply noticed that people around him seemed sad or worried. Now he understood that those observations had been the beginning of a journey that taught him lessons about leadership, compassion and human dignity that would guide him for the rest of his life. He had learned that real power came not from commanding others, but from empowering them to succeed and flourish. Most importantly, George had discovered that the greatest satisfaction in life came from using whatever advantages and resources he possessed to make genuine differences in other people's lives. The quiet kindness that had started as simple concern for individuals had grown into a philosophy of service that would shape his approach to leadership forever. As George walked through the castle corridors that evening, he noticed the same things he had observed 6 months earlier, but now everything looked different. The people he passed smiled with genuine warmth and moved with confident purpose. The castle felt alive with positive energy and mutual care. George smiled to himself, already thinking about new ways he could continue learning about leadership and service. He had discovered that kindness was not just an action, but a way of seeing the world and responding to it with creativity, courage, and love. The young prince had learned that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from choosing to use whatever influence and resources one possessed in service of others. It was a lesson that would guide him not just as a future king, but as a human being committed to making the world a more compassionate and just place for everyone.